All right, for today's build, I have 3 criteria that this has to meet. Number 1, it needs to be quick. B, it needs to come from material I have on hand. And finally, it has to fit in this small space between the wall and the couch. Since this is going to be a very fast build, we'll jump right into the action here. And I didn't need to do any milling, which was pretty nice. This was already all milled for the walnut display cabinet that I made in a previous video. I will link that down below. But I did need to joint the edge, and I'm doing this with a hand plane, and I'm showing you real time how fast this can go to get a nice straight edge for a nice clean glue up. But I did have a problem. This gouge in this one piece was making it so that the panel was going to be a little bit too small. So I took some little offcuts and glued them in to get to my full 10 inches wide, and then a little tip tap of the hammer to make sure that they were all nice and even at the bottom so that I could glue them up and clamp it nicely and securely. And the next phase is to do a few quick passes with the planer to swipe off that excess. And I left this end piece long to eat any of the snipe that I had, so I can cut that off. And a quick tip: when you have knots or holes in your project, don't grab the epoxy, grab the super glue, or CA glue as us woodworkers like to call it, and some accelerator spray. And it is just such a fast way to get through this process. In literal minutes, you can go from having a hole to having it scraped nice and clean and ready to go to move on to sanding. So I was sitting here staring at these legs thinking to myself, I know I said I was going to keep it simple. That was rule number 1. But they're just too thick. I don't think they're going to look good on such a small table. So I am going to change up my plan by adding some tapers and angles and try to get this slimmed down a little bit to make it look a little bit more proportional. So it's not going to be as simple as I thought. Hopefully it's as fast, but we'll see. Making tapers means making a jig, and all I needed to do was cut a quick 45-degree angle on a piece of wood. 45, not 46, 45. Come on, 45. Oh, I hate this table saw. And after I adjusted the 45-degree stops in the saw that somehow made it so it was sitting at 46 degrees, I was able to rip this board into a 45 to create a cradle, and that is the center point of this jig. And I secure the pieces down with a little bit more super glue and accelerator spray just to get everything in the correct position, and this just makes it so it dries in like 5 seconds, so it's nice and fast, but it still needs to be reinforced with screws to make sure it's nice and secure. Just don't put a screw where you're going to hit it with the table saw blade. And then over to the table saw, where I realize I have a bit of a problem. I put this jig together backwards, but luckily the table saw fence doesn't always have to be on the right side, and it's easily moved over to the left, so just eyeball it and line everything up, and then go ahead and make your first mistake of the project. Alright, so I stopped because I realized partway through that cut I had 2 major flaws with this jig. One, I see where my cut was going, and I wanted it to start here, and I wanted it to finish here, not here. I'm thinking the easiest way, since I already have this all set up, is just to cut an angle on this side with the track saw and kind of bring this back into alignment with where I want it. That's pretty easy. Second flaw is, as I'm cutting, this is acting as a fence. I have the blade in the middle, and this is trapping and pushing this offcut down into my blade, which is why I didn't even complete this cut, because I realized if I let it, it's going to fall down and it's going to kick back at me. To correct my mistake, I use a ruler to measure over 11 inches from the front and from the back to keep the same taper, and then I remove my block that I had there, make a quick cut with the track saw on those lines, and we're ready to get back to it. But this time I do a dry cut to make sure everything looks good before cutting the final piece, and this was an easy fix because I cut off that entire mistake. I didn't have to worry about sanding it out or fixing it some other way later. And this project required another jig because I didn't have a plan going into this, and I wanted to taper these legs even further. So this jig is going to do a second taper for me. You can see here I'm just doing another hold down and making a cut, and then I think it's a good time to do the intro. That's right, mistake number 2. I put the board in the wrong way the first time, but a quick flip and it was good to go for, woof, you see that? Table saw was hungry. And after the table saw was satiated, I flipped each board to the correct orientation to trim off the last bit, but now I had another taper, so I had to do a second hold down to keep everything nice and flat to the jig. And with the legs done, it was time to move on to the stretchers. So I rip everything and then cut them to length. And I usually would use a stop block, but in this case I'm going to do the old school method of just line them up. So cut one, the length that I want, line them up, and cut again. And that way they are exactly the same. And that's what's important for these stretchers. The overall size doesn't really matter. And now I'm going to cut my pockets for the sliding dovetails and then follow it up by cutting dovetails and the stretchers. And you can see here how I wrap my fingers around the fence. That just gives some extra support to keep everything nice and stable while I cut these. At this point in the build, I could tell you about how I'm going to hand cut off the waist to account for the rounded bottom of the router bit in the dovetail slot, but instead I'm going to talk a little bit about why sliding dovetails. After all, there are many different options for rail joinery, but sliding dovetails are inherently strong because they provide a mechanical advantage. They cannot be pulled apart based on the way that they're designed with the dovetail sliding into its slot, and it will add rigidity and strength to the table, which will mitigate racking, which is extremely important in a table that's designed to hold a single cup of coffee. And I can't go a project video without sharing the most important part of any woodworking, dry fitting. This dry fit just makes sure that everything sits nice and evenly, flushly, everything looks good, and essential to do any cleanup before you move on to final fitment and getting everything in with glue, which is a mistake that I'm fixing right now. A little bit of hand plane and spoke shave to taper it all in, and this is going to go in the back corner, so you're never really going to notice that that taper is slightly off. And then one of the final details here is just to add a quick round over to the entire top, and it'll be carried down the legs, and it'll just make everything look nice and consistent. And it's at this point in the project when all of the little details become tedious, and they're just so tedious to me that I don't think it's really worth talking about them, like sanding up to 220 grit or warming up a brand so I can put a maker's mark in the bottom of the tabletop, or grabbing some old school metal punches to go ahead and put the year into the bottom so that I remember in the future when it was that I actually made this table, how long ago that happened. It's stuff like that that's important to not forget while you're making the project, because it's so much easier to do when you can get to everything pre-assembly. Once it's assembled, it's harder to do all of the sanding and just even the punches and stuff. The legs would get in the way and it would be kind of an annoying process. But at this point, it's just a lot easier. And speaking of at this point, we're in the assembly process. We're getting some clamps on, and I had this big beetle buzzing around me the entire time. It was really annoying me, so I finally was able to get it with the mallet, and boy did I nail it. So you're going to see me do something really weird here. I'm going to put some nails in the project, and these are not structural, these are not for really anything, they're temporary, while I finish, and it just helps stand the project off of my work surface so I can get finish on there a little easier and make sure to get all the way down to the bottom. And speaking of finish, this project is pretty much finished up, so I will leave you to it and get you to the big reveal. Well, there you have it. The table fits. I think it met all three criteria. I'll say so, even though number one I kind of threw out because it's more complicated than I wanted, but it only took me about a week and a half to build. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, leave me a comment down below, and I'd really appreciate it if you subscribed and followed along. And if you liked that cabinet that I showed in the last view, I have a full build video for it right here.